When a case stays in the public eye for more than 20 years, most people assume every mystery has already been solved. That's exactly what happened with the case of Laci Peterson. For years, many believed the story was over, the evidence was clear, and justice had already been served. But in 2026, new developments have brought this famous case back into the spotlight. New scientific studies, overlooked witness statements, and long-forgotten evidence have raised questions that refuse to disappear. So, was the full story ever uncovered? Or did something important get left behind? Back in the winter of 2002, Laci Peterson was 27 years old and 8 months pregnant with her first child. She and her husband, Scott Peterson, lived a quiet life in Modesto, California. Friends described Laci as kind, cheerful, and excited to welcome their baby boy, Connor. Scott worked as a fertilizer salesman, and from the outside, they looked like an ordinary young couple preparing for a new chapter. Nothing about their lives suggested they were about to become the center of one of America's biggest criminal investigations. But everything changed on Christmas Eve. Scott later told investigators that he left home around 9:30 or 10 that morning and drove alone to the Berkeley Marina to go fishing in San Francisco Bay near Brooks Island. When he returned later that day, Laci was gone. Their golden retriever, Mackenzie, was found wandering outside with the leash still attached. Within hours, police launched a search, and before long, television crews filled the neighborhood. The disappearance quickly became national news. But what happened next completely changed how the public saw the case. Investigators soon discovered Scott had been having an affair with a massage therapist named Amber Fry. Even more damaging, he had told her he was a widower spending his first Christmas alone. Overnight, public opinion shifted. To millions watching from home, a cheating husband whose pregnant wife had vanished looked like the obvious suspect. But did that assumption shape the investigation more than the evidence itself? Prosecutors argued that Scott murdered Laci inside their home, transported her body in his truck, loaded it into his recently purchased 14-foot fishing boat, and dumped it into the bay. Yet despite that detailed theory, investigators found no blood, no tissue, and no DNA proving a violent killing had taken place inside the house, the truck, or even the boat. Only 2 strands of Laci's hair were found beneath a seat in the boat. Concrete anchors Scott had made also became a major part of the prosecution's argument, although no clear evidence showed they had ever been attached to a body. As media coverage intensified, alternative possibilities slowly faded from view. But what if another path had deserved just as much attention? In the days after Laci disappeared, more than a dozen people contacted police to report seeing a pregnant woman walking a golden retriever around East La Loma Park and nearby streets on Christmas Eve morning. Several claimed these sightings happened after Scott had already left for the marina. Witnesses described a woman with short dark hair who closely matched Laci and seemed to be struggling to control her dog. Different people, who didn't know each other, gave surprisingly similar descriptions. Was that simply coincidence, or something investigators should have examined more closely? Adding to the mystery, the mail carrier who delivered mail to the Peterson home later remembered finding the gate open while the normally noisy dog stayed silent. Some investigators have argued that if even one of those sightings had been confirmed, Scott could have been ruled out as a suspect within days. Yet police never fully retraced the witnesses' routes or treated the reports as a possible timeline that challenged their theory. None of those witnesses played a meaningful role during the trial. Their stories quietly disappeared. But while those leads were being ignored, another strange event unfolded just across the street. Directly opposite the Peterson home stood the Medina family house. On Christmas Eve, the Medinas left town for a short holiday trip. When they returned 2 days later, they found their home had been burglarized. Jewelry, guns, tools, and a safe had vanished. 2 men were eventually arrested, and both insisted the burglary happened after Laci had already disappeared. But several neighbors remembered seeing suspicious men and a van at the house on Christmas Eve itself. One even claimed to have seen people carrying away a safe. Could those memories have pointed investigators toward a completely different possibility? The story became even stranger. A confidential informant and later jailhouse conversations claimed Laci may have interrupted the burglary and threatened to call police. Then, on Christmas Day, officers discovered a stolen van burned almost beyond recognition about a mile away. Inside was a mattress that tested positive in an initial blood screening. A gas can resting on top had protected part of the mattress from the flames. Fire investigators believed the blaze had been intentionally set to destroy evidence. But why wasn't that evidence examined more thoroughly? Defense attorney Mark Garagos later argued that key details about the burned van and mattress were never shared with the defense in time. Instead of testing the entire mattress, only a small section was examined. Months later, investigators handling both the burglary and missing person cases agreed to destroy much of the remaining evidence connected to the Medina burglary. Prosecutors maintained there was no connection between the crimes. Still, destroying potential evidence while a murder investigation remained active left questions that have never completely gone away. And those questions only became more serious once science entered the picture. During Scott's trial, hydrologist Ralph Ching testified that ocean currents supported the prosecution's theory. According to his analysis, a body dropped near Brooks Island could eventually wash ashore where Laci's remains were discovered months later. That testimony became one of the pillars supporting the prosecution's timeline. But what happens when newer technology tells a different story? Years later, experts working with the Los Angeles Innocence Project used advanced computer modeling that simply didn't exist during the original trial. Their simulations suggested the recovery locations of Laci's remains and Connor's body did not match a dumping site near Brooks Island. Instead, the models pointed toward much shallower water closer to land, near Albany Bulb or another accessible shoreline. If those findings are accurate, the entire sequence presented to the jury begins to unravel. The defense also conducted experiments using a weighted dummy built to match Laci's size during pregnancy. When investigators attempted to throw it from a boat like Scott's, the small vessel became dangerously unstable and nearly tipped over during several tests. Combined with the complete absence of blood or tissue inside the boat, truck, or home, critics argue that the physical evidence never truly supported the prosecution's version of events. But perhaps the biggest challenge came from an unexpected source, the growth of an unborn child. At trial, experts estimated Connor's date of death using fetal growth charts from the 1990s and a single bone measurement. Their conclusion placed his death around December 23, reinforcing the idea that Laci had been killed before Scott left home. But medical science has advanced considerably since then. Could those older measurements still be trusted? Modern growth standards, including international research published years after the trial, suggest Connor may have died much later, possibly between December 28 and early January. One expert working with the Innocence Project even calculated a date close to New Year's Day. Interestingly, forensic anthropologist Alison Galloway had already testified during the original trial that the possible timeline extended much later than prosecutors emphasized. If Connor died days after Christmas Eve, then Laci must also have remained alive beyond the morning Scott left home. That single shift changes everything. Medical specialists have explained that one bone measurement cannot produce an exact date of death. At best, it provides a range. Critics argue the prosecution presented that range as certainty when the available science simply couldn't support such precision. If the timeline moves forward by several days, then the lack of physical evidence inside the Peterson home becomes far more difficult to explain. Was the crime committed somewhere else entirely? Scott's behavior after Laci disappeared also became central to the prosecution's case. When police finally arrested him, he had dyed his hair, carried his brother's identification, possessed a large amount of cash, and packed camping gear. Prosecutors portrayed those actions as proof he intended to flee. But defense attorneys argued there was another explanation. With nationwide media coverage and reported death threats, they claimed Scott believed disappearing temporarily was safer than remaining where nearly everyone already believed he was guilty. Which interpretation seems more reasonable? The defense also pointed to handwritten notes suggesting Laci knew Scott had purchased the fishing boat and may even have shopped for boating supplies herself. If true, that weakens the argument that the boat had been secretly purchased solely for disposing of a body. Combined with the missing forensic evidence, disputed timelines, and alternative witness accounts, critics argue the case looks far less straightforward than it once appeared. In August 2025, the Los Angeles Innocence Project formally asked the courts to reconsider these issues, citing new scientific research and overlooked investigative leads. In April 2026, Judge Elizabeth Hill rejected every claim. Prosecutors welcomed the decision, arguing nothing truly new had been presented. Laci's mother, Sharon Rocha, also dismissed suggestions that the evidence had changed. But the Innocence Project immediately prepared an appeal, sending the fight to a higher court. So where does the case go from here? Former Detective Nanette Tuzby continues to argue that every defendant deserves a complete and unbiased investigation. Chris Pixley believes the original verdict relied on scientific testimony that modern research now challenges. Mark Garagos has repeatedly stated he never believed the evidence proved Scott committed these crimes. None of those opinions automatically establish innocence. But they do raise an important question. Should changing science force us to revisit old convictions? Whether Scott Peterson is guilty or innocent remains one of the most fiercely debated questions in modern criminal history. What is clear is that several investigative paths were never fully explored. Witnesses who believed they saw Laci alive were largely ignored. Evidence connected to a nearby burglary was destroyed. New current modeling challenges earlier conclusions. Modern medical research questions the original timeline. Each issue alone may not rewrite history. Together, they create a picture that is far more complicated than many people realized. Perhaps the most unsettling part of this story isn't about one man, one family, or even one verdict. It's the possibility that once an investigation commits to a single theory, every conflicting piece of evidence becomes easier to dismiss. Institutions naturally seek finality. But justice demands something different. It demands a willingness to keep asking difficult questions, even decades later. More than 20 years have passed, yet the story still feels unfinished. Laci and Connor lost their lives. Their families continue to carry unimaginable grief. Scott Peterson continues to maintain his innocence from prison. And the public is left wondering whether every lead was truly followed wherever it might have gone. As another appeal moves through the courts, one final question remains. Will the legal system decide the original verdict still stands on solid ground, or will these new challenges finally open the door to another look at one of America's most controversial criminal cases? Only time will tell.